Hi everyone, my name is Anna and today I want to show you how to paint these light and dark colored peony flowers with gouache paints. I thought it would be fun to paint something with a lot of contrast and add a bit of gold foil as well, but if you don't own that, don't worry, it's not necessary. Any watercolor paper will work for this, so without further introductions, let's just get started. Peonies are definitely one of the more challenging flowers to draw just because of the shape and amount of petals, but I hope this tutorial will help you get started. First, a good sketch is going to be so helpful before getting started with the painting phase. You can use a regular pencil or any colored pencils if you want to keep the colors slightly closer to the final color. You won't be able to see the sketch lines much in the final image, especially when it comes to the darker flower, but it's still good to have a guide to follow while painting. I always start by drawing a light circle for the overall size of the flower, because otherwise it can be quite difficult to keep the petals even on all sides. You can also draw this smaller circle, as you can see here, which can help to visualize some of the layers. We'll see more layers in the front of the flower, and doing this also conveniently kind of marks the middle layer, which I think is usually a pretty easy place to start drawing. So you'll see me slowly starting to draw these first petals, and you don't need to follow the exact shapes I do if you don't want to. This is also the point where I always recommend finding some reference pictures of real flowers or even drawn peonies that will massively help you to get familiar with the different shapes and directions of the petals. The overall flower can be a bit rounded, as the first one of my flowers kind of ended up, where I drew some small folds that kind of create a rounded shape towards the middle, but you could leave those out too and go for more straight or outwards facing petals, which will give the appearance of a more open flower. I find the center part to be the trickiest because it's pretty hard to see what's going on there, but adding some darker center details is a good way to just kind of fill up that area, and we'll also use some darker colors here in the coloring phase. Also, your peony doesn't need to be super detailed. There are some pictures on the internet that have a huge amount of petal layers, and while that looks absolutely gorgeous, I wouldn't recommend it if you're still trying to get comfortable with the overall shape. The more layers and details you have, the harder it will be to keep track of all of those in the coloring phase. I drew the lower flower following the exact same steps, but here I didn't draw as many folds, so the petals look a bit more simple. We will outline this flower with the gold paint, so not having all those small extra sections to outline will make it a bit easier, and I also just wanted to show you a slightly different shape in general. I don't know if you can see all that too much at this point, but I hope the difference becomes a bit more clear in the coloring phase. I continued the sketching until my cat decided she wasn't getting enough attention, and after taking a break to entertain Her Highness, I finished the second flower and added a few leaves around the page as well. We'll paint the leaves at the very end, so you could absolutely do this later if you just want to focus on the flowers for now. But then it's finally time to jump to the painting phase. I thought we'd start with the lighter flower because it's a bit easier to see the color differences, and I think this will be a bit more standard flower in general. So I wanted to use some very neutral, light beige colors. So here are the paints I was using for it. I added the tiniest bit of black to this mixture, which still was way too much, but you'll also need these darker tones, so don't worry if you'll need to try a few times to get a light enough color. I know it's not going to look like it for a while, but we are starting from the lightest areas here, which for me were pretty much all the petals and folds that are facing us in the picture. I know it can be very tricky to figure out how to place the shadows in a flower like this, where there are lots of folds and shapes to keep up with. But I think a good general rule is that when you're moving towards the flower, the color should become darker. So all the inner parts of the petals will be a little bit more in the shadow compared to the outer parts that get more light. Also, the petals that are under another one also have a bit of shadow in that area where they are overlapping, and that shadowy line will kind of be the key to keep these shapes separate. You always want to pay attention to which petal is on top and then place some shadow along the outline. So it took me a while to figure out the colors here, but once I got past the beginning, you can see how I just started to switch between these few different tones. So the folded parts get the lightest beige, and then I used some of the darker colors to start coloring the larger areas and also the folds that are facing more towards the flower rather than away from it. I hope this is making sense. It's really difficult to explain, and I know that it doesn't make it any easier to see me switching colors here pretty much all the time, but I think, as always, it's perfectly fine to build things slowly. I know it might feel very intimidating to suddenly go in with a much darker color, but once we add those tones all over the flower, it will even out, and you'll most likely realize that you actually need to go even darker on some spots. I saved the very darkest shadow parts for these inner sections that are kind of between two petals. Again, seeing some pictures will help you to figure that out and also help you to see how much darker the shadow spots actually are from the main color. I was also trying to blend the colors together as much as possible by adding the dark color and then kind of blending it with a slightly lighter tone so that there wouldn't be any super harsh transitions. If you feel like things are getting messy when you try to do that, I'd probably take a clean, pretty dry brush and try to use that to blend the different tones together. Then lastly, I decided to add some slightly darker outlines on some of these petals with a very thin brush just to separate them a little bit more from each other. And we are actually going to do this even more at the very end after painting the darker flower. But for now, we are done with this light, neutral colored flower here, and we can move on to the darker one, which will actually be quite a lot easier. So I chose to go with this dark wine purple color just because the color name is literally Peony. But I showed you some other cool color options as well, like a dark blue or some kind of dark brownish red. I think pretty much any dark color would look beautiful. Anyway, this was the first time I actually used this specific paint, and it was a bit less pigmented than many of the other gouache paints I have from this brand. So you'll see how the color is a little bit splotchy, and I kind of had to go over some of these areas again with a second or even third layer. But if we ignore that for now, basically what I was doing this time was keeping this purple color on the tops of the petals, and then starting to add some black to it when moving down and into the shadow parts in general. The coloring is definitely easier without all those extra folds that we needed to work around in the first flower. You can also see that I was trying to leave these very thin white gaps between the petals just to keep track of all the outlines we'll go over with the foil paint at the end. I don't really have much to add here, so I'll leave you to enjoy some pretty piano music instead. Now that we're done with the main coloring of this darker flower, it's time to start adding those foil details and also finish the rest of the spread. If you don't own a foil color, you could definitely just use a light solid color, maybe something similar to what we used for the lighter flower. But I started here with this champagne gold that I think is the prettiest foil color I own. I just absolutely love this tone, but it was a little bit too close to the white paper color, and I just wasn't really getting the gold effect from this. So I actually decided to switch to this standard, more yellowy gold instead, and I think it pops up a little bit more. I was also planning to paint some of the leaves completely with this foil paint, so I was a bit worried that the lighter color wouldn't work for that. But I just pretty much went all over the petal outlines again, and I was using this very thin brush that will help to keep the lines as fine as possible and also the color very saturated on this small area. I think these foil paints look so nice paired with darker colors. It's a look I've used a lot in my videos throughout the years, and it just never gets old to me. But now that we are done with those gold outlines, these two flowers kind of look like they're from two different worlds, which was to be expected, I guess. But I wanted to try to make all of this look a bit more cohesive with some small changes and by adding the leaves. So first of all, I decided to add this gold paint a little bit to the middle section of the lighter flower as well. And then I started to paint these very dark green leaves around the page. The shapes are very standard leaf shapes. I didn't want to use much time for these, but I think keeping them dark kind of adds some balance with the dark flower and just evens out that dark tone all around the page instead of only being targeted to that one flower. I also added these gold leaves kind of on the opposite side to again try to balance out these tones, and then I added some gold accents to the darker leaves and later also some green accents to the gold ones. Then the last thing I decided to change was to darken some of the outlines in the lighter flower and add some of that dark purple color to it. I probably wouldn't have done this otherwise because I liked the softness we had going on here, but in this painting I think the darker outlines made sense and brought a little bit more attention back to this lighter flower. But after all that, we are finally done with this peony painting tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed watching and maybe found it helpful. I tried to keep some of the key parts slower so you can really follow along, so I hope that helped and wasn't too boring. But anyway, if this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more videos, definitely consider subscribing. And I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!